A quiet evening in Peppatown. Peppa and George are playing in the garden, laughing. The sun is slowly setting, painting the sky in orange and purple tones. Everything seems perfect, but a slight, barely perceptible feeling of unease hangs in the air. In the distance, a strange, low hum is heard, unnoticed by anyone but the viewer. Peppa suddenly stops and listens intently. George, engrossed in his toy, pays no attention. Peppa looks around, trying to understand the sound. Tree branches begin to sway slightly, though there is no wind. Shadows lengthen and distort, taking on bizarre shapes. George drops his favorite toy, a dinosaur. He bends down to pick it up, but the dinosaur disappears right before his eyes. George starts to whimper, and Peppa tries to comfort him, but she herself feels a growing fear. The humming sound becomes a little louder, almost inaudible, but palpable. Peppa and George search for the dinosaur. They look under bushes, behind trees, but the toy is nowhere to be found. The shadows around them become even more sinister, as if alive. Suddenly, a quiet, scratching sound, like a whisper, comes from behind a bush. Strange, dark footprints appear on the ground where there were none before. They lead deep into the forest bordering the garden. The tracks look as if something large and heavy dragged itself across the ground. Peppa and George, despite their fear, decide to follow the tracks. The forest grows darker and denser. The trees seem taller, their branches intertwined, forming eerie arches. The flowers, once vibrant, now look withered and pale. The humming sound intensifies, becoming more distinct, but its source is still unclear. Peppa and George hear whispers coming from behind the trees. It sounds like many voices speaking at once, but the words are indistinguishable. The whisper seems sinister and alluring at the same time. George holds Peppa's hand tightly. The tracks lead them to an old, abandoned house they had never seen before. The windows of the house are broken, and the doors creak in the wind. The house looks as if it has been abandoned for many years, but a faint glow emanates from within. Peppa and George cautiously enter the house. Inside, it is dimly lit, dust covers all surfaces. The air is heavy and stale. The glow becomes brighter, emanating from deep within the house. The humming sound is now clearly audible, coming from inside the house. Strange shadows, resembling distorted figures, move along the walls of the house. They dance and writhe, as if alive. The shadows appear threatening but do not attack. Peppa and George huddle together, their hearts pounding. They enter a room with a large, old mirror in the center. The mirror is covered in dust, but it reflects not their room, but a distorted, dark semblance of Peppatown. In the reflection, the sky turns black and houses crumble. In the mirror, a distorted reflection of Peppa and George appears. Their eyes glow red, and their smiles look sinister. The reflections begin to move independently of them, reaching out with clawed hands. The humming sound reaches its peak. In the distorted reflection of the mirror, George's dinosaur appears. In the quiet, cozy world of Peppa Pig, where every day is filled with laughter and games, sometimes night falls. But not an ordinary night, but one that brings with it shadows and whispers that make even the bravest piglets hide under the covers. Tonight was just such a night. The air was heavy, and the stars seemed to twinkle with unusual anxiety. Peppa couldn't sleep. Every rustle outside the window, every creak of the old house seemed like an ominous premonition. She tried to convince herself that it was just the wind, but her little heart beat faster and faster. George, usually so calm, was also restless tonight. His beloved Dino lay on the floor, forgotten in the darkness. Suddenly, a shadow flickered outside the window. It was too tall, too thin to be just a tree. Peppa held her breath, her eyes wide with horror. She wanted to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. What was it? And why did it move so silently? Fear gripped her, but instinct told her she needed to protect George. She slowly slid off the bed, every muscle in her body tensed. She wanted to wake her brother, but then a quiet, scratching sound came from behind the door. It sounded like claws scraping wood. The sound was getting closer. The doorknob slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to turn down. Peppa's heart stopped. A thin, ominous strip of red light seeped from under the door, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. It wasn't a flashlight, it was something else, something alien and frightening. Peppa, trembling with fear, hid under the bed. She pressed herself against the cold wall, trying to make herself as small as possible. The red light under the door pulsed as if alive. George seemed to feel something in his sleep. His breathing became uneven, and his little hands clenched into fists. The door creaked open. The corridor was plunged into pitch darkness, but in it burned two red eyes. They were like embers glowing in the night. The creature to whom they belonged was invisible, but its presence was palpable, heavy, oppressive. The air in the room grew colder. The red eyes slowly glided around the room, exploring every corner. Peppa, holding her breath, prayed that she wouldn't be noticed. One of the eyes stopped directly above George's bed. The creature seemed to be studying the sleeping piglet, and this was the most terrifying moment for Peppa. George slowly opened his eyes. His gaze fell upon two red lights hanging directly above him. The little piglet let out a piercing scream, filled with pure horror. His cry echoed through the room, breaking the dead silence of the night. George's scream awakened something more than fear in Peppa. It was determination. She sprang from under the bed, her little legs carrying her to her brother. The red eyes seemed to retreat, disappearing into the shadows, but their presence was still felt. Peppa hugged George tightly, trying to calm his trembling body. The door was closed, the red light was gone. An ominous silence fell over the room. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet evening at the Pig family house when something extraordinary happened. Peppa and George were playing in their room when they discovered an old, dusty mirror hidden behind the wardrobe. The mirror looked ordinary at first, but when Peppa looked into it, she saw something that made her gasp. Her reflection was smiling, but Peppa wasn't smiling at all. George noticed his sister's strange behavior and approached the mirror. In the reflection, he saw himself, but his skin was a different shade of pink, almost glowing. The reflection George waved at him, even though the real George was standing perfectly still. The children were fascinated and terrified at the same time. As they stared deeper into the mirror, the reflections began to move independently. Reflection Peppa started walking around in the mirror world, exploring what looked like their house but backwards. Everything was the same yet different. The furniture was in the wrong places, and the colors seemed more vivid and unsettling. Suddenly, the reflection children began beckoning to Peppa and George, gesturing for them to come closer to the mirror. Their smiles grew wider and wider, showing teeth that seemed sharper than normal. The real children felt an irresistible pull toward the glass surface. Peppa reached out her hand and touched the mirror. Instead of cold glass, her hand went right through, as if the mirror was made of water. The reflection Peppa grabbed her hand from the other side and began pulling her in. George watched in horror as his sister was slowly being drawn into the mirror world. George tried to pull Peppa back, but she was already halfway through the mirror. In the reflection world, everything looked darker and more twisted. The familiar living room had shadows that moved on their own, and the furniture seemed to breathe. The reflection family was there too, but they all had those same unnaturally wide smiles. Once Peppa was completely in the mirror world, she realized she couldn't get back. The mirror surface had become solid glass again. She pressed her hands against it, trying to break through, but it was impossible. George on the other side was crying and calling for Mummy and Daddy Pig. In the mirror world, Peppa discovered that everything worked in reverse. When she tried to speak, the words came out backwards. When she tried to run, she moved in slow motion. The reflection family surrounded her, still smiling those disturbing smiles, welcoming her to their world where nothing was quite right. Meanwhile, George ran downstairs to get help, but when Mummy and Daddy Pig came to the room, they couldn't see anything wrong with the mirror. To them, it looked like an ordinary mirror showing normal reflections. But George could still see Peppa trapped on the other side, frantically trying to communicate. The reflection Peppa had taken the real Peppa's place in the mirror, mimicking her movements perfectly whenever the parents looked. But when they weren't watching, reflection Peppa would make faces at George, showing those sharp teeth and glowing eyes that only he could see. Days passed, and George was the only one who knew the truth. He spent hours by the mirror, trying to find a way to bring his sister back. He noticed that the reflection world had its own rules and patterns. At midnight, the barrier between worlds seemed thinnest. One night, George discovered that if he said Peppa's name backwards 3 times while touching the mirror, he could briefly communicate with her. Peppa told him that the only way to escape was to find the heart of the mirror world, a place where all reflections originated. George made a brave decision. He would enter the mirror world to save his sister. At the stroke of midnight, he pressed both hands against the mirror and whispered the magic words. The glass became liquid again, and he stepped through into the backwards world. The mirror world was even stranger than it appeared from the outside. Gravity worked differently, colors shifted constantly, and time seemed to flow in circles. George, now with his skin glowing pink as Peppa had seen, began his search for his sister and the heart of this twisted realm. Together, the siblings navigated through the maze-like mirror world, avoiding the reflection family members who tried to convince them to stay forever. They discovered that the heart of the mirror world was actually their own room, but upside down and floating in a void of swirling colors. In the center of the upside-down room was another mirror, this one showing the real world. But to return home, they had to convince their reflections to switch places willingly. It was a test of courage and love between the real children and their mirror counterparts. After a tense negotiation with their reflections, Peppa and George finally convinced them that everyone would be happier in their proper worlds. The reflection children agreed to return to the mirror realm, and the real siblings stepped back through the portal. When they emerged back into their real room, the mysterious mirror had vanished, leaving only a faint outline on the wall where it once hung. Peppa and George never spoke about their adventure to their parents, but they always remembered the lesson they learned about the importance of staying true to themselves. From that day forward, whenever they looked in any mirror, they made sure to smile genuinely, knowing that somewhere in the reflection world, their mirror selves were watching and learning how to be real. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa and George woke up to find their house completely silent. No sounds of Mummy Pig cooking breakfast, no cheerful humming from Daddy Pig reading his newspaper. The yellow walls seemed darker somehow, and the familiar purple sofa looked almost black in the strange dim light. Peppa called out for her parents, but her voice echoed strangely through the empty rooms. George clutched his dinosaur toy tighter, but even Mr. Dinosaur felt cold and lifeless in his small hands. As they walked through the house, their footsteps made hollow sounds on the green carpet. The kitchen was exactly as they remembered it, except for one disturbing detail. All the family photos on the walls showed empty frames. Where their smiling faces should have been, there was only blank white space, as if they had never existed at all. The refrigerator hummed with an unsettling low frequency. When they tried to leave the house, the front door wouldn't budge. The handle turned, but the door remained sealed shut. The windows showed only swirling gray mist outside, no sign of their familiar neighborhood. They were trapped in a house that looked like home but felt like a prison. As the day wore on, strange things began happening. The television turned on by itself, showing only static with occasional glimpses of shadowy figures that looked almost like their missing family members. The telephone rang constantly, but when they answered, they heard only their own voices calling for help from somewhere far away. The toys in their playroom started moving on their own. Teddy bears turned their heads to watch the children pass, and toy cars rolled across the floor in perfect circles, never stopping. George's beloved dinosaur collection arranged themselves in threatening formations, their plastic eyes seeming to follow every movement. By evening, the house had grown colder. Their breath came out in small white puffs, and frost began forming on the windows. The familiar yellow walls started changing color, shifting to sickly greens and purples. The cheerful furniture became twisted and wrong, chairs with too many legs and tables that bent in impossible directions. When night fell, they heard footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate steps that sounded exactly like Mummy and Daddy Pig walking around their bedroom. But when they climbed the stairs to investigate, they found the room empty except for 2 perfect outlines on the bed, as if their parents had simply vanished into thin air. The final horror came at midnight when they looked in the bathroom mirror and saw not their own reflections, but the faces of their missing family members staring back with hollow, empty eyes. The reflections moved independently, mouthing words they couldn't hear, reaching out from behind the glass as if trying to escape from some terrible place where they had been trapped forever. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. The clock in Peppa's bedroom struck midnight when she woke up to the sound of someone calling her name. It wasn't Mummy Pig or Daddy Pig's voice, but something else entirely, something that made her skin crawl and her heart race. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the walls of their house like a whisper carried by the wind. George was still sleeping peacefully in his bed, clutching his beloved dinosaur toy. But as Peppa looked closer, she noticed that the dinosaur's eyes were glowing with a strange, pulsing light. The toy's mouth seemed to be moving slightly, as if it was trying to say something. Peppa rubbed her eyes, thinking she must be dreaming. But when she looked again, the dinosaur was staring directly at her. The voice called her name again, more insistent this time. It was coming from downstairs. Against her better judgment, Peppa climbed out of bed and tiptoed to her bedroom door. The hallway was darker than usual, and the family photos that lined the walls seemed different somehow. In each picture, the smiles had been replaced with blank, hollow stares. The eyes in every photograph followed her as she moved down the corridor. As she descended the stairs, each step creaked louder than it should have. The sound echoed through the house like thunder, but somehow George and her parents remained asleep. The living room was bathed in an eerie blue light that seemed to come from the television, even though it was turned off. The screen showed a reflection that wasn't quite right. Instead of showing Peppa, it displayed a figure that looked like her but with eyes that were completely black and a smile that stretched too wide across her face. The voice was clearer now, and Peppa realized it was coming from the kitchen. She followed the sound, her bare feet cold against the tile floor. The refrigerator was humming a tune she had never heard before, a melody that made her feel dizzy and confused. The tune seemed to be calling to her, drawing her deeper into the kitchen where shadows danced on the walls despite there being no light to cast them. On the kitchen table sat a tea set that hadn't been there when she went to bed. The cups were filled with a dark liquid that wasn't tea, and steam rose from each cup in spirals that formed shapes in the air. Faces, hands, and other things that Peppa couldn't quite identify. The voice spoke again, clearer now, telling her that it was time for a very special tea party, a tea party that would last forever. Suddenly, the kitchen door slammed shut behind her. When Peppa turned around, she saw that the door had vanished completely, leaving only a solid wall. The windows had disappeared too, and the room felt smaller than before, as if the walls were slowly closing in. The voice laughed, a sound like breaking glass mixed with the crying of a child. More voices joined the first one, creating a chorus of whispers that filled the air. They spoke of games that never ended, of friends who never left, and of a place where little pigs could play forever without ever growing up or going home. The teacups began to rattle on their saucers, and the dark liquid inside them started to bubble and foam. Peppa tried to scream, but no sound came from her throat. She tried to run, but her feet wouldn't move. The voices grew louder and more excited, welcoming her to their eternal tea party. The last thing she remembered was the feeling of invisible hands guiding her to sit at the table, and the taste of something bitter and cold touching her lips as one of the cups was pressed against them. When morning came, Mummy Pig found Peppa's bed empty. They searched everywhere, but she was nowhere to be found. The only clue was a new tea set in the kitchen that no one remembered buying, and the faint sound of children's laughter that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves, echoing through the house whenever the wind blew just right.